They built a luxury mountain spa that everyone in the county wanted to visit. Then they found out the spring keeping every shower hot, every treatment room open, and every bottle of fancy mineral water flowing belonged to me, not because I owned the land they built on, but because my grandfather had signed one piece of paper almost 70 years earlier that nobody bothered to read. The funniest part is they laughed at me first, sent me a bill, called me ungrateful. And by the time it was all over, they were wiring money into my account every single month just to keep their business alive. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 44 years old, and for most of my life I believe diesel engines were easier to understand than people. Give me an old excavator that won't start and I'll have it running before lunch. Put me in the middle of neighborhood politics, HOA meetings, lawyers wearing $1,000 suits, and people pretending to own things they don't, and I'd rather disappear into the mountains. That's probably why my grandfather left me the cabin instead of anyone else in the family. He always used to say, "Land doesn't care who shouts the loudest. Ethan, it only cares who can prove they own it." Back then I thought he was just an old man talking like old men do. Turns out he was trying to teach me something that would save me years later. After he passed away, I inherited his little hunting cabin outside the tiny town of Pine Hollow, tucked into the hills where the cell service disappears every few miles and everybody waves whether they know you or not. It wasn't much to look at. The roof had to be replaced. The porch leaned a little more every winter. And every spring I'd spend an entire weekend fixing whatever the snow had broken. But I loved that place because nothing ever changed. I could spend 5 days working 12-hour shifts rebuilding heavy equipment. Then drive 2 hours into the mountains, unlock that old cabin, sit on the porch with coffee before sunrise, and remember what quiet sounded like. The deed sat inside a metal lockbox along with faded tax records, survey maps, and handwritten notes from my grandfather that I never bothered reading. I paid the property taxes every year, kept the trails clear, fixed the fences when storms knocked trees across them, and never imagined the paperwork mattered beyond proving the cabin belonged to me. About a year after I inherited everything, construction trucks started rolling through the valley almost every morning. Bulldozers, cement mixers, landscaping crews. The kind of project you know has investors with deep pockets behind it. Before long, there were luxury homes climbing the hillside, a clubhouse with stone fireplaces, paved walking paths, decorative bridges, and eventually a giant wellness retreat complete with massage rooms, outdoor soaking pools, steam rooms, yoga decks, and every expensive feature people from the city suddenly decide they can't live without. I honestly didn't care. They weren't bothering me. My driveway stayed the same. My cabin stayed the same. And I figured wealthy people paying ridiculous amounts of money to pretend they were roughing, it wasn't really my problem. The only thing I noticed was that the little spring running past my property seemed lower than usual during late summer. I blamed the dry weather and moved on. Then one Tuesday afternoon, after working under a dump truck covered in grease for nearly 10 hours, I came home to find an envelope taped to my front door. It looked official enough that I thought maybe my property taxes had changed. Instead, inside was an invoice demanding $198 for private road improvements completed by the Mountain Ridge Community Association. According to the letter, I'd benefited from newly resurfaced access roads and therefore owed my fair share. I actually laughed out loud because nobody had ever asked permission to pave anything near my property. They had simply done it, then mailed me a bill afterward. I called the number listed at the bottom expecting it to be some kind of clerical mistake. Instead, a cheerful receptionist transferred me to the association president, a man named Gregory Langford. He answered with the confidence of someone who had spent years getting his own way. Before I even finished introducing myself, he interrupted and said, "Oh yes, Cabin 47, you're the one who still hasn't paid." I explained that nobody had contacted me before construction started and that I never agreed to contribute. There was a pause. Then he chuckled. Not the friendly kind either. More like someone laughing at a child who didn't understand how the world worked. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you should be thanking us. That old dirt road was practically unusable. We increased your property value." I told him my property value wasn't something I'd asked him to improve. That's when his tone changed just enough for the arrogance to show through. "Listen," he replied, "our entire community shares the mountain's natural resources. That's how these developments work. The roads benefit everyone. The water benefits everyone. And frankly, you've been getting a free ride." That single word made me stop talking. "What do you mean the water benefits everyone?" I asked. He answered so casually it still amazes me. "The spa draws from the spring that crosses your parcel. Beautiful water, by the way. Guests absolutely love it. I remember sitting down at my kitchen table without realizing I was doing it. My grandfather's spring, the same spring we'd filled canteens from every hunting season. The same spring he'd always insisted tasted sweeter than anything sold in stores. Somehow it was now supplying a luxury resort. Gregory kept talking, explaining how everything in the valley was basically shared, how nature belonged to everyone, how I shouldn't get hung up on technicalities. I barely heard another word. My eyes drifted toward that old metal lockbox sitting on a shelf in the corner of the room, the one I'd ignored for years because I thought it only held dusty paperwork. Something deep inside me remembered my grandfather smiling across the kitchen table years ago, tapping one yellow document with his finger and saying, "Someday somebody's gonna forget this exists. Don't you make the same mistake?" At that moment, I realized I had absolutely no idea what was inside that box, and I had a feeling Gregory Langford didn't either. I pulled that metal lockbox onto the kitchen table, wiped a layer of dust off the lid, and started sorting through papers that hadn't been touched since my grandfather passed away. There were old tax receipts, hand-drawn hunting maps, faded family photographs, even a grocery list from sometime in the 80s folded inside one envelope. But underneath everything sat a thick document wrapped in wax paper like he had intentionally protected it from moisture. The title immediately caught my attention. It wasn't just the deed for the cabin. Attached to it was a separate mineral estate conveyance recorded back in 1958, complete with survey drawings, county stamps, and language specifically reserving all groundwater, springs, and subsurface extraction rights to the owner of the mineral estate. I probably read the same paragraph 20 times because I couldn't believe what I was looking at. My grandfather hadn't simply owned a cabin. He had owned the water beneath that hillside, even if someone else eventually owned neighboring land around it. Suddenly, every sentence he'd ever said about protecting paperwork made perfect sense. The next morning, I took the file to a local title attorney named Claire Whitman. She looked like the kind of person who had seen every property dispute imaginable. Yet even she raised an eyebrow after reading through the documents. She leaned back in her chair, smiled just a little, and said, "Mr. Carter, if these records are accurate, this isn't just interesting. This could become extremely expensive for somebody." I asked whether she meant expensive for me. She shook her head. "No, for whoever has been using your water." Those words sat in my head the entire drive home. I wasn't excited. Honestly, I was irritated. If Gregory had simply asked years earlier, maybe we could have reached an agreement. Instead, he'd laughed at me, billed me for a road I never requested, and acted as though I should be grateful he was profiting from my family's property. That changed everything. Claire advised me not to accuse anyone until we had hard evidence proving exactly how much water the spa was taking. So instead of marching into the resort, I spent the next several days doing what mechanics do best: measuring, recording, watching. I installed a commercial-grade flow meter at the legal collection point where the spring left my mineral estate. Every morning before work, I'd stop by, write down the readings, and compare them at night. By the end of the first week, the numbers were unbelievable. Thousands of gallons had passed through that line. On Saturday, I drove up before sunrise, parked where nobody could see my truck, and watched employees unlock the spa. Tank after tank filled automatically. Guests wandered outside wearing expensive robes, sipping coffee while steam drifted over the outdoor pools. Delivery workers loaded cases of glass bottles into a van parked behind the building. Curious, I followed one shipment into town. Sure enough, the bottles were sitting inside a boutique grocery store with elegant labels claiming they contained pure mountain spring water from Pine Hollow Reserve, $8 a bottle. I actually laughed standing there in the aisle because I'd spent my childhood filling rusty thermoses from that spring for free. Now, tourists were paying premium prices for something they didn't even legally own. I bought 2 bottles just to read the label. There wasn't a single mention of my property or the actual source owner. That evening, Claire and I sat in her office calculating rough estimates. Between the spa itself, bottled water sales, treatment pools, kitchens, laundry, and guest facilities, the resort wasn't simply using my spring. It depended on it. Without that water, the entire luxury experience collapsed. "Do nothing emotional," Claire warned me. "The law is already on your side. Let them make the next mistake." Gregory made it only 3 days later. Another invoice arrived. This time it included late fees. I drove straight to the HOA office, carrying both invoices in one hand and my grandfather's documents in the other. The receptionist tried stopping me, but Gregory happened to walk through the lobby carrying coffee. He smiled the second he recognized me. "Ready to pay?" he asked. I laid the invoices on his desk without saying a word. Then I placed the survey beside them. He barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward me. "Old paperwork doesn't change community agreements," he said. I answered quietly, "You're right. County records do." His smile faded a little. I explained exactly what Claire had confirmed, that the mineral estate remained separate from the surrounding surface parcels and that the spring feeding his spa originated entirely within property covered by those reserved rights. He rolled his eyes. "You're seriously trying to tell me you own water?" "No," I replied. "I'm telling you, I own the legal right to extract and control this source." He laughed again, louder this time because several board members were nearby. "Good luck proving that." I almost thanked him. Instead, I picked up my paperwork and walked out. Claire had predicted arrogance would become our greatest advantage. The following Monday, she filed formal notices with the County Water Authority, the Environmental Compliance Office, and the Title Registry requesting confirmation of ownership records. Every letter was copied to the HOA's attorney. 3 days passed. Then 4. Nobody contacted me, which meant one thing. Their lawyers were reading. The first call finally came from a man named Richard Sloan, representing the association. Unlike Gregory, he remained polite, too polite. He complimented my documentation, then casually suggested that decades of continuous public use might somehow override my claim. Claire leaned over during the speakerphone call and scribbled 2 words on a yellow legal pad. "Ask evidence." I smiled and asked Richard whether he could provide a single recorded easement, lease, purchase agreement, or court order allowing extraction from my spring. Silence. Then he changed subjects. We ended the call 10 minutes later without either side agreeing to anything. Claire looked at me and said, "That silence just told us everything." Around the same time, I began hearing stories from contractors who had worked on the resort. One plumber admitted the developers originally planned to drill deep wells but abandoned the idea after discovering my grandfather's spring produced cleaner water naturally. Apparently, someone had assumed ownership questions would never become an issue because the cabin owner rarely visited. That sentence bothered me more than I expected. They hadn't negotiated because they believed I wouldn't notice. They had literally built an entire business model around my absence. A week later, I drove to the property carrying something far less dramatic than a lawsuit. It was an industrial shutoff assembly approved under county utility regulations. Everything had been reviewed beforehand. Everything was legal. I installed it directly at the authorized control point where my ownership allowed access, then bolted a weatherproof aluminum sign beside the valve. It simply read, "Private water source. Unauthorized commercial use, subject to immediate suspension. Contact owner." There was no threatening language, no insults, just facts and my phone number underneath. I barely made it halfway back to town before my phone exploded. Gregory didn't even say hello. "What the hell did you put on my pipeline?" he shouted. "My pipeline?" I asked calmly. Interesting choice of words. He started yelling louder, accusing me of interfering with business operations. Harassment, sabotage, extortion. I let him finish. Then I asked one simple question. "Gregory, if it's your pipeline, can you tell me why your attorney still hasn't produced a single document giving you permission to use it?" Dead silence. Then he hung up. Over the next 48 hours, things became strangely entertaining. Contractors inspected nearby hills searching for alternate water sources. Engineers discussed drilling emergency wells. Tanker trucks were considered but dismissed because the daily operating costs would destroy profit margins. Somebody even contacted neighboring landowners only to discover most surrounding springs either fell inside protected conservation zones or produced nowhere near enough flow to support a commercial spa. Gregory had backed himself into a corner without realizing it. Every expensive building he proudly shown off during grand opening weekend depended entirely on one spring and one stubborn diesel mechanic who suddenly understood exactly what his grandfather had left behind. Claire finally looked across her desk one afternoon and said, "You're holding every card now. The only question is whether you want revenge, or whether you'd rather turn this into the best investment your grandfather ever made." I thought about that for a long time because revenge feels satisfying for about 5 minutes, but a smart agreement can outlive everyone involved. I wasn't interested in destroying the resort. Dozens of employees worked there. Local businesses benefited from tourists. Families depended on those paychecks. Gregory's arrogance wasn't their fault. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted respect. I wanted compensation for years of unauthorized use. And I wanted every future owner to remember that old men who save paperwork in dusty lockboxes sometimes leave behind far more valuable inheritances than anyone realizes. The proposal Claire and I finally put together wasn't written to punish Gregory. It was written to remind him what a fair agreement should have looked like from the beginning. We calculated a reasonable monthly lease based on commercial water usage, added reimbursement for every legal expense I'd already paid, required repayment of the fake road assessments with interest, and included a royalty on every bottle of spring water carrying that fancy label people were buying in town. The final clause was my favorite because it was also the simplest. If payment was more than 5 business days late, I had the legal right to suspend commercial access until the account was brought current. No lawsuits, no arguments, just consequences. Gregory called within an hour of receiving the draft. "You've lost your mind," he snapped. "You're trying to hold an entire community hostage." I leaned back in my chair and answered, "No, Gregory. I'm offering you the chance to rent something you've been taking for free." He laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "You'll never shut down a business this size." "I hope I don't have to," I replied before ending the call. Claire looked at me across the conference table and quietly said, "He's bluffing because he still thinks you'll blink first." The next morning I drove to the control point before sunrise. I stood there listening to the water running through the pipe, thinking about my grandfather teaching me to fish in that same stream, telling me that the mountains always remembered who respected them and who only saw dollar signs. Then I reached over and slowly closed the valve. Not forever, just long enough to prove a point. 8 hours. That was all it took. By lunchtime, the spa couldn't keep its outdoor pools operating. Steam rooms shut down. Massage appointments were canceled. Guests who had paid premium weekend rates suddenly found handwritten notices taped to the reception desk apologizing for unexpected utility issues. Restaurant kitchens switched to bottled supplies. Housekeeping struggled to clean rooms. Employees looked exhausted trying to explain the situation to angry visitors who had driven hours expecting a luxury retreat. My phone never stopped ringing. Gregory called 6 times. His attorney called twice. The operations manager left 3 voicemails asking if we could at least discuss temporary access. I listened to every message without responding because they finally understood something I had realized weeks earlier. They weren't negotiating from strength anymore. They were negotiating from necessity. Late that evening, Gregory asked for a face-to-face meeting at the county administration building with attorneys present. When I walked into the conference room, he looked nothing like the confident man who had laughed at me over the phone. His tie was crooked. Dark circles sat under his eyes, and a thick stack of reservation cancellation reports rested beside his laptop. He didn't even bother pretending everything was under control. Claire slid our agreement across the table one final time. Gregory skimmed the pages before looking directly at me. "You're making a fortune because of one spring," he muttered. I shook my head. "No. I'm making a living because someone finally stopped pretending it belonged to them." There wasn't much left to argue about after that. His own attorney quietly advised him that prolonged litigation would almost certainly cost far more than accepting the lease, especially with multiple government agencies already reviewing historical extraction records. Gregory signed. He didn't smile. Neither did I. This wasn't a victory lap. It was simply the moment 2 signatures replaced months of arrogance. 3 days later, the first payment landed in my account exactly as agreed. A week after that, the reimbursement for every fake road fee arrived. At the end of the month, the bottled water royalty showed up too. I remember staring at my banking app longer than I probably should have, not because the money changed my life overnight, but because every deposit represented something much bigger than dollars. It represented respect that should have existed from the beginning. The story didn't end there, though. About 4 months later, I received an email from a new general manager introducing himself. Gregory had sold his interest in the resort after investors grew tired of the financial mess surrounding the property. The new ownership group asked if we could meet. I expected another round of negotiations, but instead the chairman shook my hand the moment I arrived and said, "We should have introduced ourselves before we ever used your spring." Those 12 words probably meant more to me than the entire contract. They honored every term without complaint, upgraded the pipeline at their own expense after asking permission first, and even added a small display inside the lobby, telling guests about the natural history of the mountain spring without pretending they owned it. Every Christmas, they send me a handwritten card. Every spring, they ask before performing maintenance. Every month, the payment arrives on time. usually a day or two early. Sometimes my friends ask whether I regret not squeezing them for even more money once I had all the leverage. Honestly, I don't. I grew up believing that winning isn't about humiliating the other person. Real winning is when the problem never comes back because everyone finally understands the rules. I still drive to that cabin 6 or 7 times a year. The porch is straighter now. The roof doesn't leak anymore. The coffee still tastes better before sunrise. And the spring sounds exactly the way it did when I was a little kid sitting beside my grandfather. The only difference is that every time I hear water flowing downhill, I'm reminded that the most valuable thing he ever left me wasn't land, wasn't a cabin, and definitely wasn't money. It was the habit of keeping old papers that everyone else assumed didn't matter. If I had thrown away that lockbox after inheriting the property, this entire story would have ended very differently. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have shut the resort down permanently after discovering what they had done? Or would you have accepted a long-term agreement that benefited everyone once they were finally forced to play by the rules? Let me know in the comments because I honestly think reasonable people could argue both sides of this one. And if you enjoy true property disputes, HOA stories, and real-world battles where patience beats arrogance, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes the strongest weapon isn't a courtroom, a lawyer, or even a contract. Sometimes it's simply knowing exactly what you already own.